There was a moment in medieval Europe when the entire economic engine began to seize, not because of corrupt kings, not because of failed harvests, but because the physical substance that made commerce possible, silver, was slowly vanishing from circulation. Mines dried up, trade bled metal eastward, a plague erased a third of the workforce overnight, and a continent that had built its entire financial architecture on one assumption, that coins held real value because they contained real metal, found itself staring into an abyss. What happened next didn't just reshape medieval economics, it planted the seeds of every financial system that followed, including the one you're living inside right now. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as stable as it looks. To understand why the silver crisis mattered, you first have to understand what Europe was building in the centuries before it struck. After the collapse of Rome in the 5th century, the sophisticated monetary networks that had once connected the empire simply dissolved. Coinage became scarce. Trade retreated to barter and local exchange. For generations, most people lived and died without ever handling significant amounts of metal money. But starting around the 10th century, something began to shift. Population grew. Agricultural yields improved with new farming techniques. Trade routes reopened. Markets expanded. And with that expansion came an urgent, unavoidable need: a reliable medium of exchange. Europe rebuilt its economy on silver. From roughly the 10th through the 13th centuries, silver coinage formed the operational backbone of economic life. Kings and local lords minted pennies, deniers, peniques, small standardized coins stamped with authority. These weren't promissory notes or abstract symbols of value. A coin was worth something because it contained a measurable quantity of silver. Strip out the metal, and the coin became worthless. This created a fundamental constraint. The money supply was geologically bounded. The great silver-producing regions of medieval Europe, the Harz Mountains in what is now Germany, the rich deposits around Kutna-Hora in Bohemia, scattered veins in France and England and Iberia, determined how much money could circulate. When mines produced well, commerce expanded. When production fell, liquidity tightened. There were no levers to pull, no policy tools to deploy, no central authority capable of stabilizing the system. The amount of money in circulation depended entirely on how much metal could be extracted from the earth. For a time, this worked. The 12th and 13th centuries brought a genuine commercial renaissance. The famous fairs of Champagne linked northern and southern European merchants and complex trading networks. Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Florence, extended commerce deep into the Mediterranean world and beyond. Feudal obligations that had once been paid in grain and labor began shifting to coin. Tax systems, armies, and courts all started depending on predictable flows of silver. Silver wasn't merely convenient, it was the circulatory system of the economy. But even during this expansion, structural vulnerabilities were accumulating beneath the surface. Europe was not economically isolated. Its merchants traded with the Byzantine Empire, with the Islamic world, and increasingly with the Far East. Spices, silk, and luxury goods flowed westward. Payment flowed eastward, and that payment was overwhelmingly silver. The Silk Road, in a very real sense, drained Europe's monetary reserves year after year. Silver migrated toward regions with stronger demand, and it rarely came back. Meanwhile, the productivity of European mines was not infinite. Medieval extraction technology was labor-intensive and technically limited. As the most accessible ore bodies were depleted, mining became progressively harder and more expensive. Output declined. The flow of new silver into European markets slowed. By the early 14th century, Europe was already experiencing monetary tightening. And then catastrophe arrived. In 1347, plague-carrying ships docked in Sicily. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population within a few years. Entire villages ceased to exist. Urban centers were decimated. Labor markets collapsed. Agricultural production plummeted. Mining was no exception. Extracting silver required skilled, organized workforces. With populations shattered and social structures destabilized, mining operations faltered exactly when the economy most needed monetary flexibility. Less silver was being produced, less silver meant less coinage meant less trade. The contraction that followed was not uniform. Death also destroyed demand, which dampened some inflationary pressures, but it was brutal in its structural effects. Tax revenues collapsed as population shrank and economic activity stagnated. Rulers who depended on silver coinage to fund armies, maintain courts, and project political authority faced fiscal crises they had no clean tools to address. In a metallic monetary system, contraction is pitiless. When coins disappear from circulation and no new metal replaces them, commerce slows. Credit becomes harder to extend.
Existing debts grow heavier in real terms as deflation erodes debtors' ability to pay. The system has no internal release valve. Medieval rulers understood the danger clearly. Political authority depended on visible power. Visible power required money, and money required silver they could not produce fast enough. So they turned to the coins themselves. Debasement, reducing the precious metal content of coins while maintaining their face value, was not an invention of the 14th century. Roman emperors had done it, but in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, it became a systematic policy tool across much of Europe. The most notorious practitioner was Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, who ruled from 1285 to 1414. Facing chronic fiscal pressure from expensive wars and an inflexible revenue base, Philip repeatedly altered the silver content of French coinage. New coins were minted with less precious metal per unit. The crown collected existing coins, melted them down, and reissued them, pocketing the difference. On paper, the nominal money supply expanded. In practice, confidence deteriorated. Merchants, who had no reason to pretend, adjusted their prices upward to compensate for coins they knew contained less silver. The result was primitive but recognizable inflation. Savers found their holdings had lost purchasing power. Wage earners faced unpredictable fluctuations in the real value of their pay. Philip's policies triggered public unrest and economic confusion. He was not alone. Rulers across Europe adopted similar tactics as they grappled with silver scarcity and fiscal stress. Debasement became the short-term answer to a long-term structural problem. It benefited rulers through the profit of minting, called seigniorage, and sometimes helped debtors settle obligations with lighter coins, but it corroded the trust that a monetary system fundamentally requires. The lesson here is one that echoes across centuries. When governments control the money supply, they find ways to expand it, whether through debasing silver coins or printing paper currency or expanding central bank balance sheets. The technology changes, the incentive structure does not.
The old system was under extraordinary pressure, but it did not collapse. It transformed. When silver became scarce and coinage became unreliable, European merchants, particularly those operating out of the great Italian trading cities, began developing something that would permanently alter the architecture of money, financial instruments that separated the function of money from the physical substance of metal. The key innovation was the bill of exchange. A merchant in Florence could deposit funds with a banking house and receive a written instrument, payable in another city, through a correspondent banking relationship. Instead of transporting chests of silver across dangerous roads and mountain passes, he transported paper. Settlement happened through networks of trust between banking families. This was a quiet revolution with enormous consequences. For the first time in European history, money was becoming a claim rather than a commodity. The abstraction required credibility, and the great banking families of Florence, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the later Medici, built that credibility through reputation, consistent practice, and reach. They extended credit to monarchs, financed long-distance trade, and processed cross-border payments with an efficiency that pure coinage could never have achieved. Double-entry bookkeeping, formalized in the 14th century and later codified by Luca Pacioli in 1494, gave these operations the accounting precision to track flows of obligation across vast geographic networks. Credit became measurable, manageable, and scalable. But every innovation creates new risks. The Bardi and Peruzzi families extended massive loans to Edward III of England in the 1330s to finance the early stages of what would become the Hundred Years' War. When Edward defaulted in 1340, both banking houses failed. The shock reverberated across Florence, credit contracted sharply, fortunes evaporated. The very innovation that had reduced dependence on physical silver now revealed the fragility of trust-based finance. Scarcity had forced abstraction. Abstraction had created new kinds of fragility. While the credit system evolved, Europe also began reintroducing gold into large-scale commerce. Florence minted the florin in 1252. Venice introduced the ducat in 1284. These high-purity gold coins were designed primarily for major commercial transactions, bulk trade, diplomatic payments, large financial settlements, where a stable, compact store of value was essential. Gold, rarer and more valuable per unit than silver, provided an alternative monetary anchor at the top end of the economic ladder. Diversification, born of necessity, was beginning to reshape the entire monetary landscape. By the 15th century, Europe operated with a layered monetary ecosystem more complex than anything that had existed before. Silver coins circulated for everyday local transactions. Gold coins facilitated large-scale commerce. Bills of exchange and credit instruments lubricated long-distance trade. Banking networks mediated flows between all of these. Power was shifting in ways that would have been unrecognizable to an earlier feudal lord. Under the classic feudal model, wealth was land. The great lords extracted rents, in kind or in coin, from agricultural territories. Political authority rested on territorial control and military capacity. But as money became more abstract and commerce expanded, urban merchant elites accumulated influence that land alone could not purchase. Banking families financed monarchs. Merchant guilds shaped policy in the city-states. Capital, not acreage, increasingly determined bargaining power. When the Medici family rose to dominance in Florence during the 15th century, they did so not through conquest, but through finance. The monetary crisis of the 14th century had accelerated a fundamental redistribution of power away from hereditary landholders and toward those who controlled the flow of credit. The instability of the 14th and 15th centuries eventually gave way to another transformation, one that came not from within Europe, but from across an ocean. In 1492, Columbus reached the Americas. Over the following century, Spanish extraction of New World silver, primarily from the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, flooded Europe with precious metal on a scale that medieval miners could never have imagined. Tens of thousands of tons of silver poured into European markets between roughly 1500 and the early 1600s. The scarcity that had constrained medieval economies became abundance almost overnight. The result was the price revolution of the 16th century. Prices across Europe rose dramatically, quadrupling in some regions over the course of 100 years. Those with fixed incomes suffered. Debtors benefited as the real burden of existing obligations shrank. Governments saw nominal revenues rise even as the purchasing power of those revenues fluctuated wildly. The medieval crisis had been deflationary, a contraction driven by scarcity. The 16th century faced the mirror image problem, expansion driven by abundance. Both episodes revealed the same structural truth. Metallic money does not guarantee stability. When supply contracts, economies contract painfully. When supply expands suddenly, purchasing power erodes. The belief that precious metals automatically anchor value misunderstands how supply shocks propagate through prices and incentives. The arc of this story points toward our own moment in revealing ways. The constraints that once defined monetary systems, the geology of silver deposits, the productivity of mines, the physical logistics of transporting coin, gradually dissolved over centuries. The gold standard of the 19th and early 20th centuries attempted to re-anchor currencies to metal, but even then, banking systems pyramided credit obligations far above the underlying gold reserves. In 1971, the United States formally ended the convertibility of dollars into gold. The modern era of fiat money began in earnest. Money was no longer tethered to metal, it was tethered to institutional trust. And trust, unlike silver, has no geological limit and no geological floor. The medieval silver crisis offers a surprisingly precise mirror for understanding modern financial disruptions. In the 14th century, Europe faced a liquidity crisis because mines could not produce enough metal to support the volume of commerce. Trade imbalances drained reserves. Demographic collapse reduced production. Monetary contraction froze markets.
In 2008, the global financial crisis produced a different kind of liquidity freeze. Not a shortage of precious metal, but a collapse of confidence in credit. Interbank lending seized up as institutions doubted each other's solvency. Markets stalled. Central banks responded by injecting liquidity at unprecedented scale, quantitative easing, near-zero interest rates, emergency credit facilities. Digital reserves replaced mined silver as the mechanism of monetary expansion. Different instruments, identical pressure. When the money supply becomes too tight, economies suffer. When it expands too fast, inflation follows. The 14th century had no central bank to manage the contraction. Today, policymakers actively manage the money supply. But active management does not eliminate risk, it relocates it, from the geology of mines to the judgment of institutions, from the scarcity of metal to the credibility of policy. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 disrupted global supply chains and triggered massive fiscal and monetary stimulus. Trillions of dollars entered the system. Inflation followed across major economies. The dynamic was structurally familiar. Sudden disruption, emergency monetary expansion, downstream price consequences. The specific technology was modern. The underlying logic was medieval. What does all of this mean for understanding money today? Every major transition in monetary history has redistributed advantage. Those who controlled silver mines held leverage in the medieval economy. Then banking families who controlled credit flows gained influence. Later, central banks and financial institutions became the architects of liquidity. In each transition, the rules of the game shifted, and those who understood the new rules earliest positioned themselves differently from those who did not. There is a temptation to romanticize metal-backed money as inherently stable. The medieval record demolishes that idea. Silver scarcity caused deflation and paralysis. Silver abundance caused inflation. Stability required more than metal. It required institutions, trust, and adaptive systems, things that are irreducibly human and therefore irreducibly imperfect.
Today, we are not running out of silver, but we are continuously redefining what money is. Central bank digital currencies, expanding balance sheets, shifting reserve dynamics, the emergence of decentralized financial systems. These are not departures from monetary history. They are its latest chapter. The medium evolves, the pressures remain. If you treat the monetary system as fixed and permanent, you become its subject rather than its student. If you understand that money is constructed, managed, and constantly mutating under pressure, you gain perspective that most people never develop. The silver crisis did not destroy medieval Europe, it transformed it. Feudal rigidity gave way to commercial dynamicism, banking families rose, accounting evolved, long-distance trade expanded. But the transformation was not smooth. Bank failures destroyed fortunes, debasement corroded trust, inflation punished the unprepared. History does not repeat in its details, but it rhymes in its structure. When the money supply tightens, fear spreads. When it expands too rapidly, confidence erodes. In both cases, those who understand the mechanics of the system position themselves differently from those who don't. Europe ran out of silver. The response was the invention of new money. We are not running out of silver today, but we are constantly negotiating what money means, who controls it, how it expands and contracts, who benefits from those movements, and who absorbs the costs. The history has the answers. I'll show you where to look.